Okay. So uh, we're going to be doing part two, and I think we should set ourselves the target of this being the final part, two and done. To this video by Emma Thorne called "Gender Criticals Have It All Wrong," or the Gender Critical Movement has it all wrong. So yeah, let's jump in. Also, do I want to be a little bit more framed differently? Yeah, why not?
That leads to disproportionately high levels of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, inadequate medical care, incarceration, and violence.
Okay. I'm not going to break every single one of those things down even remotely by like specific thing. I mean, obviously, those things like adequate medical care, which I would assume is assuming that like gender affirming care is necessary medical care, and therefore to not receive that would be a lack of adequate medical care. But obviously, I would disagree. I would say that nobody needs to have hormones or surgery that will kind of disassociate them further from the reality of their biological sex. But of course, it's worth noting that none of this would make the claims that trans identity is valid true. Obviously, it would just mean, oh, that's, I mean, again, like I say, you can show that any group of people making a claim are facing discrimination. It doesn't make what they're saying true.
The reality is not that trans people have an agenda that is somehow targeting the media, influencing children. Trans people are trying to survive, trying to exist, ideally.
You don't have to believe something in order to be able to survive. But the point is, okay, let's say from their perspective, they believe they're surviving. Well, that doesn't necessarily contradict the fact that they could have an agenda and could be trying to influence politics and could be trying to influence children. Because if part of what they think they need to do in order to survive is have it so every single person affirms their transgender identity, that's going to involve proliferating this idea that trans identities are valid, and they're going to, like I say, push that on children, push that on the media.
For the most part, trans people are just trying to live in the world peacefully with equal rights and freedoms to everyone else.
Okay, I mean, the issue is that obviously I could point out that many TRAs have attacked and been violent, and especially when you realize that to some extent, language can be a lack of peace. And you consider, for example, that particularly abusive language, I would say, is not peaceful. And you think about how much abusive language is being, directed at women mostly. And then on top of that, I mean, never mind the fact that there is often physical aggression that these women are experiencing. So that would seem to be not so peaceful. And obviously, these are just women who are basically saying, hey, I disagree that a biological male is a woman, and therefore I don't think that biological males should be allowed into women's spaces. So you can say, and I guess obviously the kind of TRA extremist position would be to say, well, that's violence to say that, and therefore we're just acting in self-defense or whatever else. But the problem is, I think that any sane person probably isn't going to want to agree with the idea that simply disagreeing with a claim about reality constitutes violence and warrants being attacked. So you kind of have to realize that as far as trans activists are concerned, this really isn't about living peacefully. Now, yeah, I kind of agree that there are sort of necessary conflicts of rights here. Like, if one person wants to believe that they have the right to have their identity affirmed, and part of that is going to be being accepted into spaces reserved for women because they want their identities as women to be affirmed, and meanwhile there are women who, for various reasons, are going to feel uncomfortable about biological males being in the same areas as them, and obviously their rights are going to be, and the kind of right for women to have their own spaces is something that has been hard won, so they're not going to want to give that up so easily. The point is, there is a conflict of rights here. There's going to have to be arguments and discussions. So obviously, like I say, it should be entirely peaceful, but there is necessarily a conflict when it comes to conflict of rights. And therefore, actually, this idea of like, well, trans people just want to live with, not affecting anybody else doing their own thing. Well, the point is, actually, if what they want is for their identities to be affirmed, they do need to affect other people. This isn't like, for example, gay relationships or lesbian relationships, where obviously they can say, well, it would be nice if people actively affirmed us. It would be nice if people, I don't know, came to our wedding or whatever else, invited us on to a couples retreat or, whatever, I don't know, whatever it is. They can say that would be nice, but ultimately the main thing they want is just they want to have their relationships in peace and just, not have other people stop them from doing what they want to do with each other. The problem with trans ID is a lot of the time it's not just stop them doing what they want to do, on their own. It's stop them doing something which would actually involve imposing themselves on other people who might not be comfortable with their presence.
The discrimination that trans people face is far, far more serious and widespread than any potential harm that trans people could do.
Okay, so using the term potential there was, I think, very much overselling the case, because obviously, there's plenty of potential. If we're talking about potential, then it's kind of game over as far as TRAs are concerned, because there is a potential for this idea, when taken seriously, to lead to literally any biological male just being able to enter any woman's space whenever they like, because they can just identify as a woman. So certainly it's not accurate to say potential. Now, I'm going to be generous and assume that what's actually being said is, well, based on, I guess, existing data, this idea of biological males who, maybe, for example, aren't even sincerely trans identified, but, whatever else, let's say, it doesn't really matter. The point is, biological males who actually wish women harm, cynically identifying as trans in order to enter women's spaces, isn't really, this massive epidemic. And to be honest, I don't know to what extent it is. What's undeniable is that there are women who definitely do feel uncomfortable, when just knowing that there are biological males in their spaces. And, there are definitely examples of trans-identified individuals entering women's spaces and doing some harmful stuff. Recently, for example, let's not forget, Yaniv is the surname. I shan't say anything when it comes to the first name, just because I don't court controversy in that regard. But recently, there was a ruling where, so for those, I'm pretty sure you all know, but I'll just remind everybody, this individual who identified as a trans woman and would then try to go to women's beauty salons and ask for their male genitalia, their biologically male genitalia, to be waxed. And then the people who ran the beauty salon might well say, hey, actually, we don't do that. We don't wax male genitalia. This is for, well, they might say this is for women only. And oh, God, that would be very trans exclusionary. But alternatively, they might say the slightly more forgivable, we just do biologically female genitalia, without necessarily any comment on whether or not that speaks to somebody being a woman. But the point is, then this Yaniv person would sue these places to basically try to go on this personal crusade to take out all of the trans exclusionary beauty salons. And recently there was a thing where, I think, is it Rebel News in Canada said, basically described this person, I think, essentially as a sex criminal, and Yaniv decided to sue them, I think, for basically defamation. And the court said, no, it's not defamation, because, and I think there's other stuff to this as well, but I don't think it was just the going into beauty salons thing, but that's kind of, I think, the famous thing. I think it gets even worse, so whatever. But yeah, basically they literally came down on the side of, no, actually, you're basically a massive perv. And the point being, it's just I think literally happened today or yesterday, that's an example of a trans-identified biological male making women uncomfortable and basically, going on quite a cynical crusade that does exist to essentially test and ultimately try to push women's boundaries. So that's not great. Now, all of that is only talking about like direct stuff. That's never mind the kind of concern about the wider ramifications for feminism and women's rights. If women when women fight for their rights, they need to be able to say, who is a woman? How much of women's progress so far would have been possible if back in like throughout the entirety of the 20th century, they'd also had to negotiate this idea that, any biological male who actually has nothing in common with, biological females is in no way actually fighting the same battle as them, suddenly has to be included in any feminist activism. I think that would have ultimately frustrated feminist activism and therefore would have caused harm indirectly. And of course, slightly more indirectly, you can ask the question of what harm does it do to society when certain ideas which aren't really backed up by logic or reason are supposed to be accepted just because it's not acceptable to disagree. Is that quite a harmful route for our society to be going down? This is kind of when you get to the point of what's the direct harm of believing the earth is flat? Or, I mean, again, I know this person's an atheist, so therefore they might actually think there's some harm for people believing in religion. So you could ask, well, what's the direct harm of people believing in religion? And I imagine a quite common response would be, well, these things aren't necessarily directly harmful, but because they are false or unsubstantiated ideas that are often being imposed in kind of quite illegitimate ways, like indoctrination and kind of brainwashing and like forcing it upon people without them being able to really think about it or kind of dispute it critically in the kind of free marketplace of ideas, that's actually harmful to society in general, and I suppose you could say maybe specifically the West with our kind of traditions of free speech and kind of Enlightenment values and things like that. And all of this is still ignoring the fact that even if you couldn't prove any direct harm, that still wouldn't make it a true claim that biological males can be women.
The reality is non-discrimination laws affect so much more than public toilets. It's a bit like when we get into conversations about sport.
I mean, was anyone thinking that this was like just limited? Like, that's obviously a specific thing. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of the weirder thing, because obviously the more appropriate thing would be changing rooms, like when you really think about it.
But when you talk about sport, public bathrooms, whatever, they really are far down the list of things that are important to the actual group of people we're talking about. The main thing in...
Well, why does it matter what's important for them? I mean, I'm not saying that like it doesn't matter at all, but like obviously the question is like the biological females who are concerned about this. Obviously, this is an important issue for them. You're basically, I mean, it just seems like a really weird response when like biological females are saying like, it makes us uncomfortable to have biological males in our private spaces. And then the response is, but have you considered this? That's not particularly important to the group that is making you uncomfortable. They don't really care about it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure women weren't like concerned because they thought that, trans-identified people cared loads.
Employment, to have that employment protected so they can't be discriminated against based on their gender, to have access to housing, public spaces.
I mean, look, okay, at the end of the day, it's just saying, well, they want all this stuff, but the thing is, like, again, like, you can have all this stuff. The problem is there's an assumption here being made that it is legitimate for these people to be making this claim, which is just pretty not true. I mean, look, at the end of the day, let me stress again, even if you do affirm trans identity, as silly as that is, in my humble submission, you still shouldn't be fired for that. You shouldn't be discriminated against for that. But it's also true that you shouldn't claim that you're being discriminated against just because people aren't accommodating your trans identity. Because, if somebody thinks, well, that's nonsense, then you can't make them not think that. So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, I mean, this is, I mean, it's one of the many examples of where there are. See, here's the thing: I don't understand why people can't just recognize that there are conflicts of rights with some things. Um, and at the end of the day, like I might agree with somebody, I might disagree with somebody, and to what extent, I guess they can expect certain actions from me in light of that disagreement is, an open discussion that's worth having. But you can't just like assume immediately that any side that has any concerns at all is illegitimate because, well, all they want is for their rights. And it's like, yeah, but there is a conflict of rights with a lot of things.
By banning gender-neutral toilets, which is one of the goals of the gender-critical movement, by banning those, first of all, back to longer wait lines for the women's toilets.
First of all, does any gender-critical person want to ban gender-neutral toilets? I'm pretty sure that the only thing gender-critical feminists care about is making it so there is at least an option for single-sex, female. Which, to be honest, I mean, I'm pretty sure, like, I would be surprised if anybody's going to disagree that in terms of, let's say, making the maximum number of people happy, the optimal solution would be female, male, gender neutral. Like, I'm pretty sure, and, therefore you can just choose, you can either, if you're biologically female, you can choose between gender neutral or women's. If you're biologically male, you can choose between gender neutral or male. I'd say the second solution would be gender neutral female. Because obviously biological males don't need their own separate spaces as much as it makes sense for biological women, given kind of the history of, gendered violence and obviously the way that it's tended, the direction it's tended to run in. So that might be kind of the second worst or second best option. But what seems to be the case now, at least I've certainly seen pictures of this, is situations where you literally have a gender-neutral toilet and a men's toilet. Like, has anyone else seen that? Like, you kind of, people will post, pictures, and again, I know this is just, singular examples, but the fact there are any examples at all is ridiculous. People will post pictures of toilets where it's literally one toilet for men, one toilet for everybody else. And that is ridiculous. But yeah, I think we can all agree that, quite simply, no gender-critical feminist, I think, wants to ban. I mean, I wasn't really paying attention to the chat, but I would be surprised if anybody said, no, we shouldn't have any gender-neutral toilets. The point is, you can have gender-neutral toilets as long as it's not at the expense of single-sex female toilets. I'm pretty sure that's the unanimous gender-critical position.
You're hurting cis people who don't conform to the typical gender stereotypes. You're hurting parents because...
Look, okay, so that whole cis people who don't conform to typical gender stereotypes thing was actually kind of glossed, like just thrown out there quite quickly. And it's obviously kind of a topic I've spoken about before. And, the reality is that generally speaking, it seems like most people don't get confused between a biological male or a biological female and, somebody who is just not conforming to stereotypes. You can tell. And so, I mean, certainly in the vast majority of cases, it's not as if a woman doesn't wear makeup or doesn't wear a dress or high heels or whatever, and suddenly everyone's just like, oh, is that a biological male? I can't tell. Should they be in the women's toilets? No, like if this is ever a genuine thing that happens, it's going to be a case of like biological females who already for some reason just look very kind of, I guess, androgynous, like they have some particular biological male features. And even then, I will say this, I think most of the time, if there's going to be people getting confused, it's most likely to be like possibly even biological male meatheads who are like, taking it upon themselves to police who's going into the toilets, rather than actual women, because I suspect most women would probably still be able to tell. But yeah, I think maybe, I do think it's quite likely that biological males might not be as attuned to the nuances and might just be like, they're going into the women's toilets, but short hair. Like anytime they see a butch lesbian. Again, I'm exaggerating, but that's the point. It's not actually attacking or hurting women who don't conform to gender stereotypes, because I'm pretty sure in my audience are a lot of women who don't conform to gender stereotypes to pretty much any degree at all, and I think they could. I mean, let's point out, like, even this person here, who is clearly not conforming to gender stereotypes of femininity, he would not be, like, in terms of, I mean, it's pretty much as simple as having, like, short hair, but yeah, like, short hair is obviously going against, traditional kind of feminine presentation. And yeah, I don't think anybody would think twice about this person entering a woman's toilet. So yeah, it's not as if just as soon as you buck the expectations of traditional masculinity or femininity, it immediately becomes impossible for anybody to distinguish between you and a biological male.
Because typically fathers, male parents, find it much harder to access baby changing facilities, things like that. That in turn reinforces stereotypes about the type of things that mothers should be doing all the time.
Okay, that is such a niche issue. And it's one of those things, again, it's just one of those things where, like, if that is a genuine concern, it can be dealt with in kind of isolation. And it's like, well, just have the baby changing in the biological male's toilets too. Like, that's a perfectly legitimate fight to make.
There is no link. There is absolutely no link between inclusive bathroom policies and bathroom safety. No link. It doesn't exist.
You can't say there's no link, but it's possible there is no link that is consistent enough to be kind of statistically evidenced. And if that is true, okay, that's, whatever. But the reality is, first of all, it doesn't change the fundamental point of biological females having their boundaries and it being inappropriate to go against those boundaries. Even if, again, like, the thing is, look, if I walk into a woman's changing room, then that's wrong. That's inappropriate for me to be doing. And it's inappropriate for me to be doing even if I identify as a woman. And it's inappropriate for me to be doing even if I whip out some, possibly not the worst thing I could be whipping out, but a study on how there is no statistical evidence of increased issues from biological males entering a women's toilet. It's still wrong for me to be there. Statistics aren't really a meaningful source of comfort to people who are immediately worried about their situation in the situation they're currently experiencing.
And it's a subject of investigation for another day, maybe, as to why trans men are so invisible in this discussion, and it's all about trans women.
In this discussion, it's because biological females don't really present a threat at all to biological males, and biological males don't really have as much of a cause, or anything like as much of a cause, to be concerned about their single-sex spaces. So it's that simple. In this case, in this specific issue of, like, the importance of single-sex spaces in light of kind of preventing gendered violence and also preventing the kind of fear and intimidation that comes with the threat or potential of gendered or sexed violence, why trans men don't really get a mention is pretty obvious.
Their spaces, their women-only spaces, infiltrated by men. That is still a man who is committing that act, who is infiltrating that space. What you are doing by making that problem trans women's problem is you're hurting other women.
Look, the point is, this is why ultimately the big question that matters is, are there any good reasons to say that a biological male can be a woman just because they tell you they are? That is the really important question. Because, yes, here's the thing. Let me be clear on this. I 100% agree that if it is obviously true that trans-identified biological males are in fact women, then, yeah, it doesn't really make sense to say they can't access women's spaces. Like, if they are actually women, they should be allowed to access women's spaces. So that's why kind of the really important issue is, well, does it make sense to say that they are women? And of course, if you don't really think it makes much sense, then you kind of have to come away being like, well, no, it's not hurting other women. It is a legitimate concern over men in your spaces.
You should have to take your birth certificate or a copy of your birth certificate to things like public restrooms. Eh? Where are we going to get all these toilet bouncers that are doing this job of...
Okay, look, sorry, yeah, I'm just going to have to say, the whole thing of like, how do you regulate it is something I've said before. My stance has always been that, yeah, I don't think this is something where you can't police it perfectly. You can maybe police it well, you can get close, you can give it the old college try. But I don't think you can even the people who do think that no trans-identified person ever passes or anything like that. The question is, okay, even if you think you're confident, do you really think that like a bouncer is going to be 100% confident in a nightclub or, wherever else? Like, do you think every single person is going to be confident all the time? No. I mean, I think realistically, you can't do it perfectly. And considering that you can't do it perfectly, therefore, obviously, you can't enforce it perfectly. But that's why, I mean, the real question, before we get into, because I think the, how to enforce it is really just a way of distracting from the most important question right now, which is, should we want to enforce it? Because I would say we definitely should want to enforce it, because we should want to say that biological females should have a right to their own private spaces, considering the history of, kind of sexed and gendered violence throughout human history, considering the relevance of that for feminism and, kind of women's fights for their rights. We should want to enforce it. And yeah, maybe we can't perfectly. And that's, that might be the case. And it might be the case in trying to enforce it perfectly. There's a degree to which we could try to enforce it and maybe even cause more damage. So, it has to be measured against other concerns. But, this all, that's why it's easier to just stick to the question and, valid, I would say also, to stick to the question of, well, before anything else, let's work out, is this something we should want to enforce? And I would argue, well, it's something we should want to enforce. How do we do it exactly? That's another question.
What the person guarding the door considers to be feminine or masculine enough. It ends up being based on...
Well, yeah, no, not really feminine or masculine. It's just, do they seem like they're biologically male or biologically female? Which most of the time works, pretty unambiguously. Most of the time people can quite easily tell.
Which is gender-based and stereotype-based, and we know that the science doesn't correlate with that. We've talked about that already.
Well, look, I mean, it's not really about gender or stereotypes or anything like that. Mostly, it's about, look, if there is a biological female who, unfortunately, I guess, in this situation, it's not really unfortunate in the strictest sense, but as far as, I guess, smoothly enforcing this particular issue, it's unfortunate, has a, uniquely biologically male-looking features. In that case, it might cause some difficulty. But yeah, like I've already said, for the case of your average biological female who just looks pretty unambiguously like your average biological female, you're not going to have any issues regardless of how much she is conforming to stereotypes.
Yeah, this entire ideology, this entire movement hinges on old-fashioned gender stereotypes.
It really isn't about gender stereotypes. Again, I guess I'm just saying this over again, but I'll just repeat it just for the record one last time. The best case, or, and the closest it gets is, well, it's, if somebody doesn't look entirely biologically, of exactly, I guess, so if somebody doesn't look phenotypical, I suppose is the easiest way to say it, then that could kind of create a situation where they, might be mistaken for a biological male or biological female, and, incorrectly so. That's it. It's not really to do with stereotypes.
Anyone who claims to be coming from a place of support and caring about people and just trying to protect people from harm should be more concerned with that harm.
Harm is relevant and harm matters, but I would say the strongest argument for the gender critical side is not the kind of harm oriented argument, but rather the what makes sense logically argument. Harm is not irrelevant, and it's a discussion worth having. But the real issue is, what kind of it's basically as simple as, what is a woman? Which I realize has become the increasingly popular question now. But essentially, the way I would say, I don't like to ask it some kind of obnoxious got you. But just to, I genuinely want to know, how do you understand the idea, when somebody says, it's quite simple. Words have meanings. Words should have meanings. It's appropriate for words to have meanings. And what kind of good definition and good functional definition of woman do you have that would include biological males? That's the question. And that's a question you can ask and discuss without ever considering, the relevance of what harm would be caused. So you don't need to talk about harm. You can, and it certainly, I would argue, still on balance, helps the gender critical side. But also when it comes to, an argument like this, we do have to consider the actual kind of logical arguments.
Let's talk about sports for a second, just because I mentioned it earlier. It is a very, very far down the list of important issues. I believe it is a scapegoat used to distract from the reality that trans people are being targeted disproportionately by hate crimes.
Really? Okay. I'm going to say this. There are people I know, several people I know, who are broadly kind of trans identity affirming, except for on the sports issue. And it's worth noting, certainly with the sports issue, even the people who argue for it, argue we should have, trans-inclusive sports, will usually have to adopt a new trans-medicalist definition for this issue, where they say, oh, well, now we're going to define it to be about, having certain, the amount of estrogen you have and things like that. So they have to define it with reference to medical transition. So even the people who say we should have trans-inclusive sports have to define it, in order to make any argument at all, have to define it as being basically, like I say, a trans-medicalism. Because the alternative would be that literally I could just identify as a woman and immediately, I don't know, I don't want to toot my own horn, but certainly I think have a massive advantage in things like things relating to certainly raw strength, also things relating to endurance. There are, of course, undeniable kind of broad physiological differences between men and women. And yeah, like I say, even people I know who are trans affirming broadly will say that, yeah, they think the idea of a biological male being able to compete against biological females in most sports is nonsense. If we had it so that sports was purely about self-identity, then when it comes to something like football, which is very much about endurance and, strength, height. Headers, right? Imagine the men's football team, England football team, in a set piece against the women's football team. How's the women's team going to be able to mark? How's the women's team if there's a competition for a header, the man's going to have a foot on the average. That's, because again, these are obviously, I'm not saying I could beat the women's football team. Obviously, they're incredibly talented kind of athletes, but there are men's football players who have literally practiced huge amounts to be header specialists. So when there's a ball coming in, they jump up and they win the header against another fully grown biological male to head the ball in and score. There is no chance that any biological female is going to ever win that competition. It's just going to be there is no way, because there are just, again, obviously the kind of least physically competent man is significantly worse off than the most physically competent woman. But when you've got the elites of the elites from both sexes going against each other, that, I don't think when it comes to football, and I mean football, but I mean, never mind rugby. Maybe cricket. Cricket women might have a chance, because that's just, that's just standing around, really.
Categorizing by hormone levels doesn't work because you eliminate cis women who have high levels of testosterone, things like that.
One of the simplest things to do is just to say, well, is this person trans? Because that's it. Like, ultimately, essentially, you look at what was this person assigned at birth. Or, I say assigned because I'm using kind of that language. But the real, more proper way of phrasing it is, what was this person observed to be at birth? So if this person was observed to be a biological female at birth, it doesn't really matter how much testosterone they have. So I think that would be the easiest way to do it.
In running, there are men with really long legs and men with really short legs. That is an acceptable advantage and disadvantage. If you have extremely long legs and a very strong build, you have the perfect build for running, lovely.
Okay, yeah, so I get where this is going. Essentially, just making the point of, well, there's that, everybody is physiologically different, and there are many people who are more physiologically capable than other people. The point is, again, and, you can apply this to even across demographic groups. For example, I think it's undeniable that there are certain racial groups who have advantages in certain sports. I think that's pretty much undeniable. I mean, I assume, like, you could say some degree of it's nurture, but I think it's, there are obviously physiological differences there. But the point is, what we would then say is, well, what kind of sociological reasons are there to make this distinction? And in this case, it's because men and women have been two kind of very distinct groups. And, when we talk about essentially what it comes down to, actually, it's really simple, is representation. Generally speaking, of course, we would say that the kind of goal of representation is pure meritocracy, where actually people achieve based on their abilities. But there are some instances where actually you want to have a meritocracy a form of representation that works against a pure meritocracy, because there are some people who, through no fault of their own, have disadvantages. And so essentially, the point I'm getting at is it's about female representation in sports. As far as I'm concerned, it's that simple. We don't need, short man representation in basketball. But do we need women's representation in basketball? I think that would make sense. I think essentially because obviously, the thing with representation is, when you talk about representation, you're implicitly suggesting that there are certain demographics where representation matters. We don't really worry about, are there equal numbers of green-eyed and blue-eyed and, kind of brown-eyed people, except for, of course, insofar as brown eyes might relate to race. But we don't really worry about, eye color, because that's not really a way in which people have been discriminated against very much. But we do worry about racial representation, because race is a demographic where we kind of say that. And, obviously there are many other things. And, to varying extents, we worry about representation. For example, I'd say the big two, if you like, are kind of race and gender. But then, of course, maybe shortly behind that is sexuality. And then you could talk about things like kind of disabilities, representation when it comes to that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's essentially just about recognizing that when we talk about representation, we are talking about, different people being different, and, representation being a top priority in some instances, but not others. And of course, yes, when it comes to men versus women, representation is an important issue. When it comes to short men versus tall men, maybe in some instances it is. If you're doing, for example, a fashion campaign for, different body types, you're going to want to have representation of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to sports, it's not an issue. So yeah, I think it's just quite simple.
It's complicated. It is not a case of, you're assigned male at birth, you go here. If you're assigned female at birth, you go here. It just doesn't work like that.
Well, I don't think that's fair, because obviously it's complicated, but something being complicated doesn't mean that when it comes to the actual rules we're going to have, they can't be, I guess, simple. In that, like, obviously things are complicated, but when it comes to actually, having a hard and fast rule, you need to just say, well, this is going to be it, and that's it. And if anything, it's to kind of the advantage, or it's better if the rule is as simple as possible, because that makes it easier to apply consistently. And of course, really what you want if you want things to be fair is for things to be consistent. The thing is, if you tried to account for all of this complexity, you would end up with precisely the issue that Emma has already pointed out as a bad thing, which is like some women not being allowed to play because they have, and by women, some biological females not being allowed to play because they have more than the prescribed amount of testosterone. The way to avoid that would be to just say that, hey, if you are observed to be biologically female at birth, then you can play in the female leagues. If you're observed to be biologically male, and that's that. I think, that's certainly a simple rule that can be applied consistently. And it's much better than having to get into like a weird thing of, well, trans people can play in the category they want to, but like then a lot of the time if people try to justify that, will say, well, only if they've had, certain amount of estrogen or, basically gone through some amount of sex reassignment surgery. It's if you do it that way, you're just making up the kind of complicated rules as you go along. So it's actually, and that's obviously worse.
The facts and traditions and beliefs first excuse for things is why it was illegal to be homosexual. We know.
What do you mean the facts and traditions and beliefs first? Like you're throwing a lot of things out there, and none of that. I mean, I just don't think that was a particularly coherent point. Was it really facts first was why people thought it was wrong to be homosexual? To be fair, this might be elaborated on, so let's see. But just for the record, if it's not elaborated on, then it does need to be elaborated on, because that's quite a weird thing to say.
Does that mean they shouldn't have equal rights and opportunities? Does that mean there shouldn't be laws in place to protect them from hate crimes and discrimination?
Even if I thought trans identity was complete nonsense, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think they shouldn't be afforded protection. I mean, for example, I think almost all religious groups get some kind of protection when it comes to hate crime legislation. So if you, for example, attack somebody because they are Muslim or Catholic or, whatever else, I think I'm right in saying that would be covered under hate crime legislation. But the thing is, obviously, I would imagine that many people who think that should be covered under hate crime legislation don't necessarily even agree with the person's religious beliefs. I don't agree with Catholicism, but I think that if somebody in, say, Northern Ireland gets attacked for being Catholic, that's obviously hate crime. So the point is, you can disagree with somebody's beliefs and still think it should be protected. But either way, the point is, when it comes to, this idea of like something being a hate crime, yes, it's something worth having, that concept. But at the end of the day, no matter what, if a crime has occurred, then that's kind of like the main issue. So, if a trans-identified person does get attacked, we can talk about, well, should there be a special consideration for the fact that they were attacked because of their trans identity? But even if we don't think that's the case, and we don't think it should be registered as a hate crime, we still obviously think it should be registered as a crime. It's not as if anyone thinks that trans-identified individuals should just be being attacked with impunity. So, and I mean, the thing is, apart from that, I mean, obviously, it mentioned a few other things, like, should they be free from, like, discrimination? The problem with that is, again, obviously, it shouldn't be regarded as discrimination to simply disagree with them. So, again, the point is, it depends. If somebody says, well, that person is trans-identified, says that they are a woman when they're not, so I'm not going to give them the job. Well, is that discrimination? Maybe. Is it appropriate? Possibly not. Again, you'll notice all of this stuff is kind of irrelevant to the actual question of whether or not they're correct, which is kind of, I guess the point of like most ideas of social justice. You don't need to be right in order to, get the basic kind of standards of being treated appropriately. But the problem is, a lot of the time it seems like trans-identified individuals saying that how they should be treated, the only appropriate way to treat them is to 100% affirm their gender identity. And of course, that is not appropriate.
So we should do everything we can to prevent them being hurt by hate crimes, to prevent them from being discriminated against. That's it. It should be that simple.
See, again, this is just like such a weird argument because essentially at this point now, the main focus seems to be, should trans-identified individuals be subject to violent, and I assume we're talking violent, again, I'm being charitable here and assuming this isn't talking about like saying that misgendering is a hate crime. So in that case, the question is literally, should trans-identified individuals be subject to violent attacks, pretty much? And that's not really an argument that anybody is having. Nobody's, like, that's the thing. This has become very removed from the actual argument to the point where I don't really have anything to say in response. Like, I can't, if the point's going to be made, well, no matter what, trans-identified people should be protected from violent crime, my response would be, yes, that's true.
Again, a lot of this comes from a specific type of religious bigotry. Not all of it, but a lot of it. They imagine that this is...
I mean, first, I like, obviously most gender-critical feminists, I would say, aren't religious. I can't imagine very many are at all. But, okay, maybe it's just saying, well, it's like a kind of, it's kind of pseudo-religious. And okay, I will entertain that and see whether or not there's going to be a good argument for how the logic is kind of pseudo-religious.
Either something satanic, this is something I've seen people say on YouTube a lot, by the way, that it's something satanic, this is simply the influence of the devil, and that is why we need to stop them. Or they say that trans people are trying to affect the children, that trans people are trying to encourage children to be trans.
Okay, look. Those are two different things, first of all. So the point about it being satanic, I don't know any gender-critical person who thinks it's satanic. The thing is, you've got to bear in mind, I'm pretty sure most gender-critical people would actually be more likely to make an analogy to kind of religious indoctrination when it comes to how children are being raised to believe that biological males can be women and that you are a horrible, evil person if you deny that. I mean, I think there's a much better argument that is more analogous to kind of fundamentalist religious attitudes towards, children and kind of children being able to think critically about certain claims, and okay, I have to give this comment a shout out. One of the biggest satanic panic people of the 1980s is a gender therapist now. That's interesting.
None of them have come up with a good explanation as to why, and I've never seen any...
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I literally made a video. That's so funny. Because I literally made the video this Tuesday about that question of, like, why do people believe what they believe? And I specifically did kind of talk about how one of the problems with conspiracy theories is that there is often that question of why. And then I kind of got into the question of, like, why, you saw the video. Of course, you all saw the video. But I will repeat anyway, pretty simply, I made the point that I think there are two reasons why people affirm trans identity. And of course, the reality is that why they affirm trans identity, and I guess you might say the next question would be, why do they try to push for this idea, which I'll just say in a second. But why do they affirm trans identity? The points I made is, one, because I think a lot of people just assume that, like, the kind of progressive left is a bundle deal where you have to take everything. So a lot of people, I think, are not actually affirming trans identity because they themselves have looked into it and, like, independently kind of reason that it makes sense, but rather because they're just like, well, I'm on the progressive left, I'm not a conservative or whatever else, and everyone knows that if you're on the progressive left, you have to affirm trans identity. That would be point one. And then point two, as I kind of said, is that a lot of people are raised with this idea that being a man or woman means something beyond biological reality, and that makes sense why they would be receptive to people pushing this idea of, actually, you can be a woman even if you're biologically male because of some woman essence, or because you live your life as a woman. Like a generation of people who've been raised on kind of Barbie and Action Man are probably going to have this idea in their head of, oh yeah, there is such a thing as living your life as a man and living your life as a woman, because it's like, those are quite extreme kind of gendered expectations being attached to the label of man and woman there. And therefore, yeah, if somebody like ContraPoints comes out and says, I live my life as a woman, people, that's going to mean something to a generation of kids I say, a generation, of course, every generation of kids who's been raised with this idea of, well, there is, that femininity and masculinity are a part of what it means to be a woman or a man. Now, the kind of question would be, well, why do they push the ideas? Because, of course, I think that's a very good explanation for why people believe this stuff, but the point made was, well, they can't give an explanation for why these ideas are being pushed on kids or whatever else. And yeah, I think it's as simple as when people believe stuff, they want other people to believe that. I think it's just quite a human nature thing. Like, most of the time when people believe things, they will to some extent try to advocate for those beliefs, even pretty minor things. So that's one reason. But I mean, the other thing is, okay, that it's not like gender and sex are quite big aspects of human society. So of course it makes sense that if people have very strong opinions on, relating to that, then it makes sense they would want to push it. This isn't like a minor issue like our hot dog sandwiches.
There is no reason based on facts, evidence, or science to discriminate against trans people. If you know the science, if you learn the history...
Look, discrimination really needs to be kind of defined here, because again, like this seems to be the main focus here. Like the main conclusion to this video seems to just be, don't discriminate against them. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, based on a reasonable definition of discrimination, I would agree, but does discriminate mean not accept their claims about reality? Because that's not discrimination. Yeah, again, I mean, it's kind of funny because this person obviously is an atheist enthusiast. I kind of would suspect they're somebody who probably got started off talking about religion, because looking at a lot of their stuff is about religion and atheism, all that kind of stuff. And yet, you could very easily imagine all of this stuff being said by a religious person and imagining how this person would respond to that. Like, imagine a whole video where, obviously, I kind of already made this analogy, so I won't go through the beginning, but then the video ends with them just saying, even if religious people are wrong, it's not okay to discriminate against them. And it's like, I would imagine if you're an atheist who was watching that, you'd be thinking, well, yeah, obviously. Like, that's the thing. It's funny that you can imagine, I mean, this could be said about any kind of spurious claim, and of course, the reaction of anybody who's skeptical to that spurious claim would be the same, of like, well, yeah, I guess, obviously, we shouldn't be discriminating against them. But the fact you keep bringing this up almost makes it seem as if you think discriminating against them would include disagreeing with them, which obviously is not, what should be included in the definition of discriminating against somebody.
And learn that it is only something that is perpetuated by transphobes and bigots with an agenda of their own, and that there is no evidence to support anything of this kind. You accept...
What do you mean? I mean, here's the thing. If the trans agenda, as far as I'm concerned, is literally just the idea that trans identity is valid and that this should be accepted by everybody, and that it is a great evil if there is anybody who doesn't accept this idea. I would be comfortable calling that the transgender, and of course that undeniably does exist. I mean, again, I always make this analogy as well. There is no kind of equivalently spurious claim that has a literal law saying that it is true. And yet in the UK, and I imagine many other countries too, there are some equivalents to this, but in the UK we have the Gender Recognition Act saying by law that it is true that a biological male can be a woman. So I would call that on its own sufficient evidence for an objectionable agenda.
Nothing else makes sense to you, whether that's because of your religious beliefs or otherwise.
I mean, it's just like religion is highly unrelated to any of this. I mean, I think I've pointed out before that honestly, the Bible is pretty mute on this topic of like trans identity, which kind of makes sense because, this was really trans identity as it is currently presented only really kind of started in like the 90s with Judith Butler. And even then, I feel like it was something like, I reckon, I mean, it was post 2000s really that you got this full on idea of your, trans identity is literally just that, just an identity. It doesn't require any kind of sex reassignment or any kind of surgery or anything like that. And of course, this idea of being non-binary and things like that. This discussion just wasn't really around anything like as much until the, like I say, the 2000s. That's kind of undeniable.
To try and lower the rate of discrimination that trans people face. The reality of this conversation is sex is not binary.
Well, look, okay, you say there's no reason. Here's the thing. Yes, unless somebody's going to say that the only way that I can stop this violence against trans-identified individuals is to stop basically believing what I believe and being critical of that which I do not believe has been sufficiently evidenced. If you're going to say that is what I need to do to go against this violence, then I have to say, well, there is a very good reason for me not to do that, which is that I can't sacrifice truth for kind of utilitarian moral reasons. I don't think that's, that's a dangerous slippery slope apart from anything else, because where might that lead to? But yeah, I think ultimately truth is intrinsically valuable, and therefore to say you need to stand against violence against trans-identified individuals, I'd be like, yeah, sure, absolutely. And I don't think I need to say this because, let's be honest, okay? I'm pretty sure we're all kind of clear on the fact that the vast majority of violence against trans-identified biological males, and probably biological females as well, comes from, I think it's quite overwhelmingly male violence rooted in sexual aggression. And if not sexual aggression, then, I guess just rooted in generic masculine aggression. But, I don't think it's a coincidence that there is obviously a quite evident correlation between the reality of many trans-identified individuals facing violence and many trans-identified individuals being prostitutes. I don't think that's an irrelevant thing. But yeah, I think ultimately this is about male violence, and specifically the kind of meathead, I guess, hyper-masculine male violence that is not going to be being expressed by anybody who's gender critical, obviously not biological females, but even, biological males. Generally speaking, I would not think that I would have to... You look at, the people who are kind of biologically male who are gender critical, first of all, a lot of them are gay, but then apart from that, I guess, there are some straight people, obviously there's me, Graham Linehan, Rubble of Empires, and none of them, I think, seem to be particularly prone to, kind of typical male aggression. So with all of that said, this isn't an issue of gender critical people. So therefore, I don't think I need to say, hey guys, don't be violent. Ultimately, we're all clear on the fact that, that there shouldn't be violence, and gender critical people aren't engaged in this violence. It is biological males who, let's be honest, I think are just as likely to be violent against gender critical women as they are against anybody else. Now, having said that, if you then say, well, saying don't be violent is not enough, your rhetoric leads to this violence and therefore you need to stop your rhetoric, then I'll have to say, no, if you want to get me to stop speaking and stop expressing my points of view, you have to argue against it. You can't just say, well, your points of view lead to violence and therefore you need to stop it.
We should be and we can be so far past these old gender stereotypes that this shouldn't...
Whoa, hold on a minute. We should be past these gender stereotypes. If we're so past these gender stereotypes, how could anybody believe that being a woman is anything other than just pure biological reality? That's the issue. I don't really see how we can say we should be past gender stereotypes, but then say that trans, identified males live as women. That would seem to imply some degree of stereotype.
Whatever your feelings, and if you are still gender critical at this point, it is based on feelings and not facts. That is...
We haven't had any facts that would contradict being gender critical. So that's the end of the video, and the end of the response in total. Emma's points weren't great, as you probably saw, I'm not even sure once I've edited this down. I mean, this took 2 streams to react to, but that's because I was really chatting to the chat. When it actually comes to just editing the stuff which I think is remotely important and addresses anything that Emma actually said, I'm not even sure how long this will have ended up being. And if it's not ended up being that long, well, that speaks to the fact there wasn't much of substance said. But, I can only work with what I'm given. So I'm sorry if you thought this was a bit substanceless, but, I do what I do. And you shouldn't let that put you off liking and subscribing and sharing and commenting and all of that stuff. You can also give on Patreon if you want, or give on PayPal, or that's about it, actually. But that's enough. Actually, you know what? No, I'm going to say this now, because by the time this goes up, it will be the 17th of July. And I don't know if I want to give away the exact date of my birthday, just because, I don't know, that seems like one of those things you're supposed to keep a little bit secret. But I will say that my birthday is in mid-August. And, therefore, if you remember last year, I suggested that if you wanted to, I don't know, facilitate me learning more about this stuff, you could go and order me. It's like an Amazon wishlist thing. I don't know if you, I might even link to the video where I brought this up last year, because there you go. I brought it up last year and it went really well. I got like actually quite a big number of books from it, and my audience has only grown since then. So logically I should get even more. So yeah, I'm going to link in the description when this goes up to, as an edited thing, to my Amazon wish list, which is going to have all sorts of things in there. I mentioned just now in the stream that I still haven't read Helen Joyce's Trans. I should have it by now. So there you go. If that's an obvious thing to get me. Although don't everybody, it should be a system where, like, if somebody gets me one of the things, then it won't appear for anyone else. But I don't know. Maybe it could be one of those situations where everybody thinks somebody will get me Helen Joyce's book, and then nobody does. In which case, you know what? I'll just get it. But yeah, there you go. Any book that you look at, it could be even a completely random book that I didn't ask for, I guess, maybe. All right, anyway, okay. All of that's just a thing. So there you go. That's, I guess, if you don't want to give any money on PayPal or Patreon, then maybe, yeah, that's another way you could help out the channel. Because obviously, yeah, it helps me do the channel while also, not making me have to spend money, which we love. All right. And I'll just say thanks to my current patrons.